Here's something that'll mess with your head. For 99.9% of human history, nobody was white. Not because people didn't have pale skin, some did, but because white as a category, as a way of organizing humans into groups, simply didn't exist. If you could travel back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, or medieval Europe, and you asked someone, "Are you white?" they'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. They'd tell you they were Roman, or Athenian, or Norman. They might mention their tribe, their city, their language. But white? That word wouldn't mean anything to them. Not the way it means something now. The ancient Egyptians had at least 5 different words for skin tones, but none of them mapped onto what we'd call racial categories. The Greeks divided the world into Greeks and barbarians based on language and culture, not melanin. The Romans didn't care what color you were as long as you paid your taxes and worshipped the right gods. Skin color was just another physical trait like height or hair texture. Sometimes people noticed it. Usually they didn't. It certainly wasn't the basis for organizing entire societies, for deciding who could marry whom, who could own property, who was fully human. The concept of whiteness, as we understand it today, is shockingly recent. Most historians trace it to the 1600s, maybe the 1700s. It emerged alongside colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade as a way to justify the unjustifiable. Which means that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans evolved, migrated, adapted to new environments, and changed in countless ways, all without anyone thinking of themselves as white or black or any other color-based category. But here's the question that scientists have been obsessing over for decades. Setting aside the social construct, setting aside the politics and the history, there's still a biological puzzle at the center of all this. Why do Europeans have pale skin in the first place? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I read through them, and it's wild. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at 2 a.m., London during lunch break, all in the same comment section. Now, you'd think this would be a settled question in science. We've mapped the human genome. We've sequenced DNA from ancient humans going back hundreds of thousands of years. We've got satellites measuring UV radiation at every point on Earth. Surely we know why some populations developed light skin and others didn't, right? Wrong. Not even close. In fact, the more we learn, the more complicated and controversial the answer becomes. There's the traditional theory, the one you probably learned in school. Is about vitamin D and sunlight and a simple evolutionary trade-off. It makes perfect sense, fits together beautifully, and might be completely wrong, or at least incomplete. Then there's the Neanderthal theory, the idea that Europeans didn't evolve pale skin at all. They inherited it from another species entirely when our ancestors interbred with them 40,000 years ago. There's the milk theory, which sounds crazy until you look at the evidence. The notion that a single dietary change, the ability to digest lactose as adults, somehow triggered a cascade of genetic changes that lightened skin across an entire continent. There's the sexual selection hypothesis, the controversial idea that Europeans, especially European men, simply preferred pale-skinned partners, and thousands of years of that preference literally changed what Europeans looked like. There's the disease angle, tuberculosis, rickets, mysterious evolutionary pressures that had nothing to do with sunlight and everything to do with survival in crowded, filthy medieval cities. And then there's the newest, most disturbing theory based on cutting-edge genetic analysis. The possibility that the pale-skinned people we think of as indigenous Europeans actually aren't indigenous at all, that they arrived from somewhere else, relatively recently, bringing genes for light skin that hadn't existed in Europe before. Each theory has evidence supporting it. Each one has prominent scientists defending it, and each one contradicts the others in fundamental ways. The established textbook explanation is being challenged by genetic data that keeps rewriting what we thought we knew about human evolution. It's a scientific controversy playing out in real time, and most people have no idea it's even happening. What makes this story even stranger is that the answer matters, not just for understanding our evolutionary past, but for understanding what race actually is and isn't. Because if we can't even agree on how Europeans became pale-skinned, how can we claim that racial categories are biologically meaningful? So let's go back, way back, to a time when all humans were dark-skinned, and let's trace the twisted, complicated, controversial path that led to some of us looking the way we do today. They came face to face somewhere in the Middle East, maybe the Levant, possibly the foothills of what we now call Turkey. Modern humans, fresh out of Africa, carrying the genetic legacy of hundreds of thousands of years of tropical sun adaptation, and Neanderthals who had been living in Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. What happened next is written in your DNA. If you're of European, Asian, or Native American descent, roughly 2 to 4% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. If you're of purely sub-Saharan African ancestry, you carry almost none. This isn't theory or speculation. This is hard genetic fact, confirmed by dozens of studies analyzing DNA from both living people and ancient Neanderthal bones. The implications are staggering. It means our ancestors didn't just encounter Neanderthals. They had children with them. Children who survived, reproduced and passed on Neanderthal genes that are still active in billions of people today. But here's where it gets really interesting for our story about pale skin. Some of those Neanderthal genes that modern humans inherited are related to skin pigmentation. And not just any pigmentation genes, but specifically variants associated with lighter skin, hair, and eye color. The gene that's gotten the most attention is called MC1R, the melanocortin-1 receptor. This gene is basically the master control switch for pigmentation in mammals. It tells your skin cells how much melanin to produce, what type of melanin, and when to make it. In 2007, a team of geneticists did something remarkable. They extracted DNA from Neanderthal bones and sequenced the MC1R gene. What they found changed the conversation about human pigmentation forever. The Neanderthal MC1R gene had mutations that, in modern humans, are associated with pale skin, red hair, and freckles. Not just one mutation, but multiple variants that all point in the same direction. Reduced pigmentation. The implication seemed obvious. Neanderthals, after adapting to Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, had evolved light skin. When modern humans interbred with them, we inherited some of those light skin genes. Mystery solved, right? Europeans are pale because our ancestors mixed with pale Neanderthals. Not so fast. Science is never that simple. First, let's understand what we're really talking about when we say Neanderthals had light skin. The genetic evidence doesn't tell us they were all uniformly pale. What it tells us is that they carried genetic variants that reduced pigmentation compared to tropical populations. They might have ranged from olive to fairly light, depending on the individual and the specific population. Some Neanderthals probably looked quite different from others. These weren't a monolithic species any more than modern humans are. They were spread across Europe, Western Asia, and parts of Central Asia. Different groups adapted to different local conditions. A Neanderthal living in sunny southern Europe probably looked different from one living in the permanently frozen regions near the Ice Age glaciers. But the evidence does suggest that, on average, Neanderthals had lighter pigmentation than the modern humans who first encountered them. This makes perfect evolutionary sense. Remember, Neanderthals had been living in Europe for over 300,000 years when modern humans arrived. Europe during the Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was dim. Winter days were short. Even summer sunlight came at an angle that reduced its intensity. Cloud cover was frequent, The same selection pressures that we discussed earlier, reduced sunlight selecting for lighter skin to maximize vitamin D production, had been operating on Neanderthals for 250,000 years longer than they'd been operating on Europeans. They had a massive head start on the adaptation process. So when modern humans, still carrying their tropical pigmentation, encountered Neanderthals who'd already adapted to low-light conditions, something fascinating happened. They didn't just compete. They cooperated, they traded, and yes, they had children together. The genetic evidence shows this wasn't just one or two isolated incidents. Interbreeding happened multiple times, in multiple locations over thousands of years. Different groups of modern humans encountered different groups of Neanderthals, and when conditions allowed, the two species mixed. Now picture this encounter from the perspective of those first modern humans entering Ice Age Europe 40,000 years ago. You're part of a small band, maybe 30 or 40 people, exploring territories your species has never seen before. The landscape is alien. Massive glaciers dominate the horizon. The animals are different. Woolly rhinoceros, cave bears, herds of reindeer stretching to the horizon. And then you encounter them, other humans, but not quite, stuck here, with massive bones and powerful muscles, faces that are recognizably human but subtly different, prominent brow ridges, receding chins, noses that seem impossibly large, and their skin is lighter than yours. Their hair comes in shades you've rarely seen, red, blonde, light brown. Some have eyes that are pale blue or green instead of dark brown. They're wearing sophisticated clothing, tailored furs and leather designed for the brutal cold. They have fire, tools, language. They're clearly intelligent, clearly capable, clearly human in every way that matters. But they're also clearly adapted to this environment in ways your people aren't. They know where to find food in winter. They know how to track and kill the massive Ice Age mammals. They know which plants are safe to eat, which caves provide the best shelter, which river valleys flood in spring. Your people have a choice. You can fight them for resources, trying to displace a species that's been perfecting its survival strategies for hundreds of thousands of years. Or you can learn from them, trade with them, maybe even form alliances through marriage. Some groups probably chose conflict. The archaeological record shows evidence of violence between humans during this period, but others chose cooperation. And when young people from the two groups fell in love or formed strategic alliances through marriage, the genes mixed. The children of those unions inherited traits from both parents. The adaptability and innovative thinking of modern humans, combined with the cold weather adaptations and local knowledge of Neanderthals. Some of those children inherited the Neanderthal variants of MC1R and other pigmentation genes. These children had lighter skin than their modern human parent, darker skin than their Neanderthal parent, and crucially, in the dim light of Ice Age Europe, that lighter skin provided advantages: better vitamin D synthesis, reduced risk of rickets and other deficiency diseases, healthier bones, stronger immune systems, better reproductive success. Over hundreds of generations, the Neanderthal pigmentation genes spread through the modern human population in Europe, not because anyone was choosing lighter-skinned mates, but simply because lighter skin provided survival advantages in low-light conditions. The genes were selected for. Individuals who inherited them were slightly more likely to survive and reproduce. Multiply that small advantage across thousands of generations, and eventually, those Neanderthal variants become common in the European population. Today, geneticists can track specific genetic variants in modern Europeans back to Neanderthal origins, variants associated with skin pigmentation, hair color, and even immune system function. Is like having a map of ancient interbreeding events written directly into our DNA. But here's where the controversy comes in. Not everyone accepts that Neanderthal admixture explains European pale skin. The critics raise some valid points. First, the timing doesn't quite work. Modern humans encountered Neanderthals around 40,000 to 60,000 years ago, depending on the region. But genetic analysis suggests some of the pigmentation genes in modern Europeans evolved more recently, maybe only 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. That's a huge time gap. If we inherited light skin from Neanderthals 50,000 years ago, why did it take another 40,000 years for those genes to become common in Europe? The second problem is that the specific variants of pigmentation genes most common in modern Europeans don't always match the Neanderthal variants we've found. The MC1R mutations that give some Europeans red hair, for instance, are different from the Neanderthal MC1R mutations. They're in the same gene, but they're different changes. This suggests they evolved independently, not through interbreeding. Third, and perhaps most damning, populations in East Asia also carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, sometimes even more than Europeans. But they didn't evolve the same type of pale skin that Europeans did. If inheriting archaic human DNA automatically makes you pale, why didn't it work the same way in Asia? The defenders of the Neanderthal admixture theory have responses to all these criticisms. On timing, they argue that genes can persist at low frequencies for thousands of years before becoming common. Maybe Europeans carried Neanderthal pigmentation genes as rare variants for millennia, and then environmental changes around 8,000 years ago, perhaps related to agriculture and diet, subtly made those variants advantageous. On the specific variants, they point out that pigmentation is controlled by dozens of genes working together. We might have inherited some components of the light skin system from Neanderthals and evolved others independently. The end result, pale skin, could be a mosaic of ancient admixture and recent evolution. On the Asian question, they note that different populations encountered different archaic humans. Europeans mixed primarily with Western Neanderthals. Asians mixed with both Eastern Neanderthals and Denisovans. Each archaic population might have had different pigmentation adaptations. Plus, the environments were different. The selective pressures in East Asia weren't identical to those in Ice Age Europe. The truth is, we still don't fully understand how much of European pale skin came from Neanderthals and how much evolved independently. The honest answer is probably both. Modern Europeans are a genetic mixture of multiple source populations. African modern humans who evolved dark skin for UV protection, Neanderthals who had already adapted to low UV environments, and our own ancestors who continued evolving in Europe for thousands of years after Neanderthals disappeared. Each source contributed something to the final picture. What we can say with certainty is that Neanderthal DNA is still active in modern humans, still influencing how we look, how our immune systems respond to diseases, even how we think. We're not purely modern humans, we're hybrids, the product of tens of thousands of years of interbreeding between multiple human species. And some of that Neanderthal heritage shows up in the mirror every morning, in skin that's lighter than our African ancestors, in hair that comes in shades they rarely saw, in eyes that reflect the Ice Age adaptations of a sister species that no longer exists. Except they do still exist. In us. In our genes. In the pale skin that marks us as descendants of that ancient encounter between two human species who are different enough to have evolved separately for 500,000 years, but similar enough that when they met, they recognized each other as human. But the Neanderthal connection is only part of the story. Because even after modern humans absorbed whatever pigmentation genes Neanderthals had to offer, pale skin kept evolving, kept getting lighter in some populations. Something else was driving the selection, something that would push human pigmentation to extremes never seen before in our evolutionary history. Now we get to the part where things become truly extreme, where the environment stopped being merely challenging and became actively lethal to anyone who wasn't perfectly adapted. We're talking about the last glacial maximum, 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, when ice sheets up to 2 miles thick covered most of northern Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Picture this. Your ancestors are living in what we now call France or Germany, except it doesn't look anything like modern France or Germany. The forests are gone, replaced by frozen tundra. The average annual temperature is 10 degrees Celsius colder than today. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between London and northern Alaska, between temperate forests and permanent ice. Winters lasted 8-9 months. Temperatures regularly dropped to -30, -40 Celsius. No crops growing, no gathering berries or digging roots. Just endless frozen wasteland, and whatever animals were tough enough to survive in these conditions — mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, Arctic foxes, everything covered in thick fur or layers of fat, and your ancestors, relatively hairless primates who had evolved in tropical Africa, were trying to survive in this. They had fire, yes. They had clothing made from animal skins. They had shelter in caves and temporary structures. But even with all that technology, survival was borderline impossible. The archaeological record from this period shows something chilling. Population collapse. Sites that have been continuously occupied for thousands of years suddenly abandoned. Human remains becoming increasingly rare. Genetic analysis suggests the European population crashed to maybe tens of thousands of individuals scattered across the entire continent. These weren't thriving communities anymore. These were desperate survivors clinging to a handful of refugees where conditions were barely tolerable. Southern France, parts of Spain, isolated valleys in Italy where glacial geography created slightly warmer microclimates. Most of Europe was simply empty of humans, too cold, too dark, too deadly. And here's where the biology gets really interesting. When you have small, isolated populations under extreme environmental pressure, evolution goes into overdrive. It's called a bottleneck effect, and we've seen it before in human history, but this time it was different. This time there was a specific environmental factor creating intense directional selection pressure. Sunlight, or rather, the lack of it. Even in summer, northern Europe during the Ice Age was dark. Cloud cover, dust from glacial grinding, smoke from volcanic eruptions trapped in the atmosphere, plus the extreme northern latitude meant these populations were living in perpetual twilight. Maybe a few months of decent sunlight during the short summer, then 8 or 9 months of darkness broken only by brief, weak daylight hours. This created a biological crisis that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with chemistry. Vitamin D. Your body needs it to absorb calcium, to build bones, to maintain immune function. Without enough vitamin D, children develop rickets. Their bones soften and deform. Adults develop osteomalacia. Their bones become brittle and break easily. Pregnant women can't properly nourish developing fetuses. The immune system fails, making people vulnerable to every passing infection. Humans get vitamin D 2 ways: from food, specifically fatty fish and organ meats, and from sunlight. When UVB radiation hits your skin, it triggers a chemical reaction that produces vitamin D. Simple, elegant, works perfectly as long as you have enough sunlight. But Ice Age Europeans didn't have enough sunlight, and they couldn't rely on diet alone because fatty fish was seasonal and not always available. Organ meats from hunted animals helped, but not enough to make up the deficit. Here's the cruel equation. Dark skin is wonderful for protecting against too much UV radiation. It's loaded with melanin, which blocks UV rays and prevents skin damage. If you live in Africa or South Asia or anywhere near the equator, dark skin is a massive evolutionary advantage. It protects you from skin cancer, from UV damage, from all the problems caused by too much sunlight. But in Ice Age Europe, dark skin became a liability. The melanin that protected African populations from too much UV was now blocking the tiny amount of UV available. People with darker skin simply couldn't produce enough vitamin D. Their children developed rickets and died young. They themselves became weak and susceptible to disease. Women couldn't successfully carry pregnancies to term. And here's where natural selection becomes brutally simple. Any genetic variant that reduced melanin production, that made skin even slightly lighter, increased vitamin D synthesis. And that meant survival. We're not talking about cultural preferences or mate choice or gradual drift. We're talking about life and death. Children with lighter skin surviving to adulthood. Children with darker skin dying before they could reproduce. The genetic evidence for this is overwhelming. When researchers analyze the genes responsible for skin pigmentation in modern European populations, they find something remarkable. These genes show what's called a selective sweep. That means they were under incredibly strong natural selection very recently in evolutionary terms. The genetic variants for lighter skin didn't just gradually increase in frequency. They exploded across the population in just a few thousand years. Think about what that means. For millions of years, human skin color was relatively stable. Our ancestors in Africa maintained dark skin because it worked. Then modern humans expanded out of Africa and into Europe, probably still with relatively dark skin. For thousands of years, they got by well enough, not thriving, but surviving. Then came the last glacial maximum. Suddenly conditions became so extreme that only the lightest-skinned individuals could get enough vitamin D to stay healthy. Within just a few thousand years, maybe 10,000, maybe less, the entire European population transformed. Not through mixing with other populations, not through migration, but through simple, brutal selection. The dark-skinned individuals died. The lighter-skinned individuals survived and had children. By the time the ice retreated around 19,000 years ago, the Europeans who emerged from their refuges were fundamentally different from the ones who had entered the Ice Age. Pale skin, light hair in many cases, blue or green eyes, all genetic variants that had been rare or non-existent 10,000 years earlier were now dominant. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. The selection wasn't uniform across all European populations. Different groups developed different solutions to the vitamin D problem. Some populations in Eastern Europe developed genetic variants that made their skin extremely pale, almost translucent. These are the ancestors of modern Northern Europeans, Scandinavians, Russians, populations who live at extreme latitudes where sunlight is still limited even today. Other populations in Southern Europe developed different variants. Their skin lightened, yes, but retained more pigmentation. They stayed olive-toned, darker than Northern Europeans, but lighter than their African ancestors. This makes sense because Southern Europe, even during the Ice Age, got more sunlight than the North. The selection pressure was real, but less extreme. And some populations developed entirely different strategies. Genetic studies show that some Ice Age Europeans developed variants that increased their ability to extract vitamin D from food. Enhanced absorption in the gut, better processing in the liver and kidneys. These variants show up in modern populations that traditionally relied heavily on fish, suggesting their ancestors adapted by maximizing dietary vitamin D rather than just increasing skin synthesis. The archaeological record supports all of this. Ice Age sites from 20,000 years ago show evidence of sophisticated fishing techniques. Bone harpoons, net weights, fish traps. These people weren't just hunting mammoth. They were exploiting every possible food source, including cold water fish rich in vitamin D. They were using both genetic adaptation and cultural innovation to solve the sunlight problem. But the human cost was staggering. Population genetic analysis suggests that maybe 90% of the European population died during the worst phase of the last glacial maximum. Entire lineages disappeared. Groups that had lived in Europe for thousands of years simply went extinct, leaving no genetic descendants in modern populations. The ones who survived were tough, yes, but also lucky. Lucky to be born with the right genetic variants. Lucky to live in refuges where conditions were just barely tolerable. Lucky that their parents had taught them the survival skills necessary to endure years of darkness and cold. And when the ice finally retreated, when temperatures began to rise and grasslands returned, and animals moved back into the empty territories, the survivors expanded rapidly. They carried with them not just pale skin, but all the other adaptations that had been selected for during the crisis. Cold tolerance, efficient metabolism, ability to survive on a high-protein diet, social systems capable of maintaining cooperation through long, dark winters. These were the people who would eventually become modern Europeans, the ancestors of everyone from Ireland to Russia, from Scandinavia to Greece, all descended from a few thousand survivors of the worst climate disaster to hit the continent in hundreds of thousands of years. And they were about to face another transformation, one that would complete the evolution of European appearance and set the stage for everything that came after. But that transformation wasn't driven by nature. It was driven by something humans invented, something that would prove just as powerful as natural selection in shaping who we became. Here's something that's going to sound completely bizarre until you look at the evidence. There might be a connection between your ability to digest milk as an adult and the color of your skin. No, really. Stay with me here, because this is one of the strangest and most controversial theories about human skin color evolution, and it all starts with a map. Picture this. You take a map of Europe and you color-code it based on where people can drink milk without getting sick. Lactose tolerance in adults. It's going to be darkest in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the British Isles, parts of Germany and the Netherlands, gradually fading as you move south and east. Now take another map, same region, but this time you're marking the distribution of pale-skinned genes, the really light-skinned populations. Overlay those maps. They match almost perfectly. Same region, same population, same distribution pattern. Northern Europeans are both the palest people on Earth and the most likely to be able to digest milk as adults. Coincidence? Maybe. But here's where it gets interesting. Both traits emerged at almost exactly the same time. Around 7,500 to 5,000 years ago, something happened in Northern Europe that caused two dramatic genetic changes to sweep through the population at unprecedented speed. One mutation allowed adults to continue producing lactase, the enzyme that breaks down milk sugar, something that normally shuts off after childhood in most mammals, including most humans. Another set of mutations dramatically reduced melanin production in skin, hair, and eyes, creating the pale complexions we associate with Northern Europeans today. Now, orthodox theory says these are separate adaptations. Lactose tolerance spread because it gave people access to a valuable new food source. Pale skin spread because it helped with vitamin D production in low sunlight environments. Two different evolutionary pressures, two different solutions, just happening at the same time in the same place. But a small group of researchers has been asking a different question. What if they're not separate? What if the ability to drink milk actually caused the lightening of skin, or at least made it possible? The theory hinges on something called the calcium-vitamin D connection. Your body needs vitamin D to absorb calcium from your diet. Without enough vitamin D, it doesn't matter how much calcium you're eating, your body can't use it effectively. You develop weak bones, dental problems, a whole cascade of health issues. For most of human history, people got their calcium from plant sources, nuts, seeds, leafy greens, whatever they could find. Not huge amounts, but enough if you had adequate vitamin D to help absorb it. And you got vitamin D from sunlight triggering its production in your skin. The darker your skin, the more sun exposure you needed, but in Africa that wasn't a problem. Sun was abundant. Then humans moved north. Suddenly you're in environments where winter days are short, skies are often cloudy, sun exposure is limited. Dark skin, which had been protective in Africa, becomes a liability. You're not producing enough vitamin D. Without enough vitamin D, you can't absorb calcium effectively. Your bones weaken, your teeth decay, your chances of surviving and reproducing drop significantly. Standard theory says this created pressure for skin to lighten, allowing more efficient vitamin D production from limited sunlight. And that makes perfect sense. It's probably the main driver of skin lightening. But then something happened that changed the equation entirely. Somebody figured out that you could drink milk from domesticated animals, not just as babies, which mammals have been doing forever, but as adults. And more than that, you could ferment it into cheese and yogurt that would keep for months. Suddenly you had access to massive amounts of calcium, like orders of magnitude more than you could ever get from plants. A single cup of milk contains more calcium than you'd get from eating a pound of kale, and it's bioavailable, easy for your body to use. But here's the catch. You still needed vitamin D to absorb all that calcium, and the darker your skin, the more sun exposure you needed to produce adequate vitamin D. In Northern Europe, with its limited sunlight, dark-skinned individuals drinking lots of milk would face a problem. They'd be consuming huge amounts of calcium but potentially lacking the vitamin D needed to absorb it properly. This is where the controversial part comes in. Some researchers argue that the introduction of dairy actually intensified the selection pressure for pale skin. Think about it like this. Before dairy, the pressure to lighten skin was real, but maybe not overwhelming. You could survive with darker skin if you were careful about getting enough sun exposure, if you ate a diet balanced for your vitamin D limitations. But once populations started consuming massive amounts of dairy, the vitamin D requirements shot up. You needed more vitamin D to handle all that calcium. Suddenly, pale skin wasn't just helpful, it was crucial. Individuals with the genetic mutations for lighter skin could produce vitamin D more efficiently, allowing them to actually benefit from all that calcium they were drinking. Better bone density, better dental health, better overall nutrition. They survived longer, had healthier children, passed on both the pale skin genes and the lactose tolerance genes together. In this scenario, milk didn't just spread alongside pale skin. It created the conditions that made pale skin transition from advantageous to absolutely necessary. The two traits became locked together, spreading through the population as a package deal. This would explain why the correlation is so tight, why the palest populations are almost always the most lactose tolerant, why both traits emerged at the same time with the same geographic distribution. But hold on, there's a major problem with this theory. Actually, several problems. First, the timeline is incredibly compressed. These genetic changes swept through European populations in just a few thousand years. That's lightning fast for evolution, especially for traits that aren't directly life or death. Yes, vitamin D deficiency is bad, but it's not instantly fatal. It takes years to develop serious problems. Could natural selection really work that quickly on these traits? Second, we have the cart and horse problem. Did lactose tolerance enable dairy consumption, or did dairy consumption drive the spread of lactose tolerance? And where does skin color fit in that sequence? Maybe the genetic mutation for lactose tolerance appeared first, allowing some individuals to exploit a new food source. These individuals thrived, their populations expanded, and they carried both the lactose tolerance gene and whatever skin color genes they happened to have. If the original population where lactose tolerance emerged happened to already be relatively pale, maybe from earlier vitamin D-related selection, then both traits would spread together without any causal connection between them. Third, and this is the big one, we have populations that completely break the pattern. Some Central Asian and East African populations have high rates of lactose tolerance, but don't have European pale skin genes. They developed dairy cultures independently, evolved lactose tolerance through different genetic mutations, but didn't become pale. This suggests that lactose tolerance and pale skin aren't actually causally linked. They can evolve independently. The correlation in Europe might just be coincidence, or more accurately, the result of both traits happening to emerge in the same founding population that then expanded across Northern Europe. The Yamnaya pastoralists, who we'll talk about in detail later, brought both dairy culture and certain pale skin genes into Europe around 5,000 years ago. Maybe they just happened to have both traits, and the spread of one didn't cause the spread of the other. They were just hitchhiking together on the same population expansion. So why do some researchers still find this theory compelling? Because the biochemistry is real. The calcium-vitamin D connection isn't speculation, it's established physiology. High calcium intake does increase vitamin D requirements. Pale skin does produce vitamin D more efficiently, and the timing of both traits emerging together in Northern Europe is striking. Maybe the milk theory isn't the whole story, but it might be part of it. Perhaps lactose tolerance didn't cause pale skin to evolve, but it did accelerate selection for genes that were already present at low frequencies in the population. Before dairy, maybe 1 in 1,000 people had genetic variants for very pale skin. Selection was gradually increasing that frequency, but slowly. Then dairy arrives, consumption skyrockets, and suddenly those pale individuals have a significant advantage. The selection pressure intensifies. The frequency of pale skin genes shoots up much faster than it would have otherwise. In this modified version, milk didn't create pale skin, but it did act like an accelerant, speeding up evolutionary changes that were already happening. And there's one more wrinkle to consider. The theory works in reverse too. Some researchers have argued that maybe pale skin came first, and that actually enabled the dairy revolution. If your population is already pale due to earlier vitamin D selection, you can handle the vitamin D demands of high dairy consumption more easily. This makes dairy culture more viable, more sustainable, more likely to become a central part of your economy and diet. Darker-skinned populations attempting to adopt dairy culture in northern latitudes might face more vitamin D-related health problems, making the cultural transition less successful. The dairy culture and accompanying lactose tolerance genes would be less likely to spread. Under this scenario, pale skin didn't result from dairy consumption. Instead, pale skin made dairy culture possible, or at least more successful in northern environments. It's a completely different causal arrow, but it still explains why the two traits are so tightly correlated. The honest answer is we don't know for sure. The milk theory remains controversial because the evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. What we do know is that something dramatic happened in Northern Europe around 7,000 years ago. Two major genetic changes swept through the population at unprecedented speed. Whether they're causally linked or just coincidentally connected through population expansion is still being debated. But the correlation is real, the biochemistry makes sense, and the timeline is suspicious. So maybe, just maybe, the reason Northern Europeans became the palest people on Earth has something to do with the fact that they also became the most dedicated milk drinkers in human history. Or maybe it's just one of those strange coincidences that evolution throws at us sometimes. Two separate adaptations that happen to emerge in the same place at the same time, leaving us scratching our heads and arguing about causation thousands of years later. Either way, it's a reminder that human evolution is messy, complicated, and full of surprises. The simple stories we tell rarely capture the whole truth, but they sure are fascinating to think about. Now here's where the story gets really uncomfortable, because there's another theory about how Europeans became pale that has nothing to do with vitamin D, rickets, or survival advantages. This theory suggests that Europeans chose whiteness, that they actively selected for lighter skin through mate preference, generation after generation, until pale skin became the dominant trait. not because it helped them survive, but because they found it attractive. This is sexual selection, and it's one of Darwin's most brilliant but least understood ideas. Natural selection is about survival. The traits that help you live long enough to reproduce get passed on, but sexual selection is about mating. The traits that help you convince someone to reproduce with you get passed on, even if those traits don't help you survive. Sometimes, especially if they don't help you survive. Think about a peacock's tail. That massive, colorful display doesn't help the bird survive. Actually, it makes survival harder. The tail is heavy, conspicuous, and makes flying more difficult. A peacock with a smaller, duller tail would be faster, more agile, better at escaping predators. But he'd also be less likely to mate because peahens prefer males with large, elaborate tails. So the impractical tail persists because females keep choosing it, generation after generation. The trait spreads not because it aids survival, but because it aids reproduction. Could the same thing have happened with skin color in Ice Age Europe? The theory goes like this. Imagine you're living in a small hunter-gatherer group somewhere in what's now France, 30,000 years ago. Your community has maybe 50 people, and you've known every single one of them your entire life. You've grown up seeing the same faces, the same features, the same general appearance, repeated across your extended family and the handful of neighboring groups you trade with. Then one day, a stranger appears. Maybe from a group that migrated from a different region, maybe the child of parents from distant communities who happen to carry rare genetic variants. And this person looks different. Their skin is noticeably lighter or darker than anyone you've ever seen. Their hair has an unusual color or texture. They're novel, exotic, completely unlike anyone in your immediate experience. Here's what anthropologists have observed in modern populations. Novel traits often become sexually attractive. Humans seem to have a psychological tendency to find unusual features intriguing, memorable, worth paying attention to. This makes evolutionary sense. Mating with someone genetically distant from you produces offspring with more genetic diversity, which often means better immune systems and fewer genetic diseases. So we evolved to find difference attractive. In a small population where most traits are relatively uniform, any variant that stands out might become disproportionately attractive, and if that variant is genetic, it gets passed to the next generation. If those children also find mates, the trait spreads. Within a few dozen generations, something that was once rare becomes common, not because it helped anyone survive winter or avoid rickets, but simply because people kept choosing it. Could pale skin have spread through Ice Age Europe this way? Here's what makes it plausible. The genetic evidence shows that several key skin-lightening genes didn't just appear once and spread uniformly. Instead, they show what's called positive selection in multiple populations independently. This suggests something was actively favoring these traits beyond just passive adaptation to low UV environments. One study found that genes controlling light skin and light hair color show the strongest signals of recent positive selection in European populations, stronger even than genes controlling lactose tolerance, which we know provided massive survival advantages. Why would cosmetic traits show stronger selection than nutritional advantages, unless something other than survival was driving the change? Some researchers point to the unusual diversity of hair and eye color in European populations compared to other groups. Nowhere else in the world you find populations where blue, green, gray, brown, and hazel eyes all appear in the same community. Nowhere else do you see the range of hair colors from black to brown to red to blonde, all mixing in the same gene pool. This diversity doesn't make sense if selection was purely about survival. You'd expect one optimal trait to dominate. But it makes perfect sense if sexual selection was favoring novelty and diversity itself. Here's another piece of evidence. The genes that control light skin in Europeans are different from the genes that control light skin in East Asians. Both populations independently evolved lighter skin after moving to northern latitudes, but they did it using different genetic variants. If it was purely about vitamin D synthesis, you'd expect the same solution to evolve in both places, the most efficient genetic change for increasing UV absorption. But if sexual selection was involved, you'd expect different populations to favor different variants based on local mate preferences, which is exactly what we see. But there's a darker implication to this theory that researchers rarely discuss openly. If sexual selection drove skin lightening in Europe, it implies that Ice Age Europeans systematically preferred lighter-skinned mates over darker ones, that they made choices, generation after generation, that moved their population toward paleness. This isn't passive adaptation to environment. This is active preference, cultural choice encoded into biology. Some researchers have suggested that harsh Ice Age conditions intensified mate competition in ways that amplified sexual selection. During the worst periods, when resources were scarce and survival was marginal, the population would have been male-biased. Why? Because pregnancy and nursing made females more vulnerable to starvation and cold stress. In any crisis, women of childbearing age die first, not because they're weaker, but because reproduction is metabolically expensive. You can't gestate a baby and survive a famine at the same time. If there were more males than females in Ice Age populations, competition for mates would have been intense. Any trait that made an individual more attractive would provide massive reproductive advantages. And if novelty was attractive, then rare variants like light skin could spread rapidly through sexual selection, even if they provided no survival benefit or were slightly disadvantageous. But here's where the evidence gets thin and the theory becomes really controversial. We have almost no direct archaeological evidence for mate selection preferences in Ice Age populations. We can't know what they found attractive. We can't survey them about their preferences. We can only look at the genetic patterns their choices created and try to work backwards. What we do have is art, and Ice Age European art is weird when it comes to human representation. The famous Venus figurines, those small carved female forms found across Ice Age Europe, show enormous variation in how they depict human bodies. Some are realistic, others highly stylized, but none of them clearly indicate skin color. Cave paintings occasionally show human figures, but again, they're typically simplified outlines that don't convey pigmentation details. There's one tantalizing exception. Some cave paintings in Spain and France show humans with what might be body paint or tattoos. But we can't tell if this represents actual skin color variation or just decoration. The archaeological record is frustratingly silent on exactly the question we most want answered. Did Ice Age Europeans care about skin color? Did they have preferences? Did those preferences drive genetic change? What makes many scientists deeply uncomfortable with the sexual selection theory is that it attributes the evolution of racial characteristics to human choice rather than environmental pressure. It suggests that at least some of the physical differences between human populations resulted from cultural preferences encoded through mate selection over thousands of generations. This implies that racial characteristics aren't just passive adaptations, but potentially the products of ancient beauty standards. That's a disturbing thought for a species trying to move beyond racial thinking. It's more comfortable to believe that skin color differences are purely functional adaptations to different UV environments. Darker skin near the equator protects against sun damage. Lighter skin far from the equator allows vitamin D synthesis. Clean, mechanical, environmental cause and effect with no implication of choice or preference. But evolutionary biology is rarely that simple. Most traits are shaped by multiple selection pressures simultaneously. Natural selection and sexual selection often work together. It's entirely possible that light skin provided vitamin D advantages in northern latitudes and was also perceived as attractive, with both factors amplifying each other and accelerating the evolutionary change. In fact, that's probably the most accurate answer, though it's also the most complex and least satisfying. Europeans didn't become pale purely because of vitamin D deficiency. They didn't become pale purely because they chose lightness. They became pale because of a complex interaction between environmental pressure, genetic drift, dietary changes, and quite possibly mate preferences that we can barely detect in the genetic record and will never fully understand. But the sexual selection theory refuses to die, even though it makes scientists uncomfortable, even though the evidence is ambiguous, even though it opens doors that many would prefer to keep closed. It persists because the genetic patterns keep suggesting that something beyond pure survival pressure was shaping European appearance during the Ice Age, and because human behavior across cultures and throughout history shows that we do have mate preferences, we do find certain features attractive, and those preferences do change gene frequencies over time. The question isn't whether sexual selection can change human appearance. We know it can. The question is whether it did during the Ice Age in Europe, and how much of the change toward lighter skin resulted from choice versus environmental necessity. And that's a question we may never definitively answer. The people who made those choices have been dead for 20,000 years, and they left no written record of what they found beautiful or why. What we're left with is genetic echoes of ancient preferences, patterns in DNA that suggest selection happened faster and more strongly than environmental adaptation alone would predict, and a lingering uncomfortable suspicion that at least some of who we are physically resulted not from where our ancestors lived, but from who they chose to sleep with and why. But the story gets even more complicated, because just when you think you understand how Europeans became pale, another factor enters the picture, one that nobody saw coming until very recently. But there's another piece of this puzzle, one that nobody talks about because it's not romantic, not about conquest or migration or dramatic climate events. It's about disease, and specifically, it's about what happened when humans started living on top of each other in permanent settlements. For most of human history, we lived in small groups, 20, 30, maybe 50 people moving through the landscape, rarely staying in one place long enough for waste to accumulate or diseases to establish themselves. But around 10,000 years ago, that changed. Agriculture meant permanent settlements. Permanent settlements meant villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities, and cities became disease incubators. In Northern Europe, this transition created a perfect storm of evolutionary pressure that nobody saw coming. Picture a medieval town in what's now Germany or Britain. Stone buildings packed together, narrow streets that never see direct sunlight, smoke from thousands of cooking fires creating a perpetual haze, waste accumulating in corners and gutters, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people living in spaces that would have supported maybe 50 hunter-gatherers. And in those dark, crowded conditions, a killer was waiting. Tuberculosis. TB had probably been with humans for thousands of years, but it had never found conditions this perfect. The bacterium spreads through the air, thriving in enclosed spaces where people breathe the same air day after day. In northern European cities where winter meant staying indoors for months, where sunlight was already limited and buildings blocked what little there was, tuberculosis became epidemic. By the Middle Ages, TB was killing somewhere between 20 and 40% of all Europeans who reached adulthood. In some cities, the rate was higher. This wasn't just a disease. This was a selection pressure as intense as anything the Ice Age had thrown at our ancestors. But here's where it gets interesting. TB doesn't kill everyone equally. The bacterium is particularly deadly to people whose immune systems are already compromised. And one of the most important factors in immune function is something most people never think about: vitamin D. Your body synthesizes vitamin D when ultraviolet radiation from sunlight hits your skin and triggers a complex chemical reaction. This vitamin D doesn't just build strong bones, though that's important. It's also crucial for immune function. Vitamin D helps activate T cells, the specialized immune cells that fight bacterial infections. Without adequate vitamin D, your immune system is essentially fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Now, here's the problem. Melanin, the pigment that makes skin dark, blocks ultraviolet radiation. That's literally its job. In Africa, where humans evolved, melanin protects against skin cancer and folate destruction from intense sunlight. But in Northern Europe, where sunlight is weak and winter days are short, melanin becomes a liability. A person with dark skin living in medieval London or Oslo might spend months each year unable to synthesize adequate vitamin D. They'd be chronically deficient, their immune systems perpetually weakened, and when tuberculosis came through town, which it did regularly, they'd be far more likely to die. The genetic evidence for this is startling. Studies of ancient DNA from European populations show that genes associated with light skin pigmentation were still being actively selected for as recently as 5,000 years ago. Not 50,000 years ago during the Ice Age. Not 20,000 years ago when glaciers covered half of Europe. 5,000 years ago, historical times, when agriculture was already well established, when civilizations were rising, when people were building cities and writing laws. This means skin lightening wasn't just a prehistoric process. It was still happening when the pyramids were being built, when Stonehenge was being erected, when the first cities were rising in Mesopotamia. The selection pressure was that intense. But TB wasn't working alone. It had an accomplice, a disease so closely tied to vitamin D deficiency that it's basically the visible manifestation of the problem: rickets. Rickets is what happens when children don't get enough vitamin D during their rapid growth years. Their bones soften, unable to mineralize properly. Legs bow under the child's own weight. Ribs deform, creating the characteristic rachitic rosary that physicians learn to recognize. Pelvic bones develop abnormally, which meant that girls who survived rickets often died in childbirth years later, their malformed pelvises unable to allow a baby's head to pass. In Northern European cities, rickets became endemic. Medical records from 17th and 18th century London show rickets rates approaching 50% in some neighborhoods. Half the children showing visible bone deformities from vitamin D deficiency. And once again, the disease didn't strike equally. Dark-skinned children, unable to synthesize adequate vitamin D from the weak sunlight filtering through London's notorious fog and smoke, developed rickets at catastrophically higher rates than their lighter-skinned neighbors. This created brutal selection pressure on a generation-by-generation basis. Every winter, every childhood was a test. Children who could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently, which meant children with lighter skin, had stronger bones, grew straighter, survived more often. Girls with lighter skin were more likely to reach adulthood with pelvises capable of giving birth successfully. The ones who died, or who survived but couldn't reproduce successfully, were disproportionately darker-skinned. Natural selection in action. Not in some distant prehistoric past, but in historical times, in cities we can name, in conditions documented in medical records and church registries. Recent genetic studies have actually quantified this. Researchers analyzing DNA from ancient European skeletons can track the spread of light skin alleles, specific genetic variants that reduce melanin production. What they found is shocking. Some of these alleles were still increasing in frequency in European populations during the Bronze Age. Others show signs of positive selection continuing into the Iron Age, less than 3,000 years ago. One study examined genetic markers from over 1,000 ancient individuals spanning 8,000 years of European history. The results showed that while some skin-lightening alleles were ancient, possibly inherited from Neanderthals or selected for during the Ice Age, others appeared much more recently and spread remarkably fast. The gene SLC24A5, which has a massive effect on skin pigmentation, was still increasing in frequency in southern Europe just 5,000 years ago. The gene SLC45A2, another major player in skin color, shows evidence of selection in northern Europe continuing even more recently. This doesn't match the old story of Ice Age selection creating white Europeans 40,000 years ago. It matches a much more complex process of ongoing selection, driven by multiple factors over tens of thousands of years, with particularly intense selection happening after the adoption of agriculture and the rise of urban living. Because that's when the disease pressure really accelerated. Hunter-gatherers, even in northern Europe, spent their days outside, exposed to whatever sunlight was available. They ate fish rich in vitamin D. They moved frequently, never accumulating the waste and crowd density that allowed TB to spread efficiently. Agricultural and urban populations lived differently. They spent more time indoors. They ate grain-based diets lower in vitamin D. They lived in permanent settlements, where disease could establish itself and spread efficiently. And in northern latitudes, where winter sunlight was already inadequate for vitamin D synthesis in dark-skinned individuals, this lifestyle shift created a death trap. The archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletal remains from early agricultural populations in northern Europe show high rates of vitamin D deficiency diseases, bowed leg bones indicating rickets, porous bone lesions suggesting TB. These markers become more common as settlements grow larger and more permanent. By medieval times, the pressure was enormous. Tuberculosis was endemic, rickets was epidemic, and both diseases were systematically killing darker-skinned individuals at higher rates than light-skinned ones. Generation after generation, the population was being winnowed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. A few percentage points difference in mortality here. A slightly higher rate of childbirth complications there. Over hundreds of generations, these small differences add up to massive evolutionary change. The really dark irony is that this means European whiteness might be partially a product of urban crowding and poor sanitation. The very conditions we associate with civilization, permanent settlements, cities, technological advancement, created the disease pressure that selected for light skin. If Europeans had remained hunter-gatherers, if they'd never adopted agriculture or built cities, they might still be considerably darker. The diseases that killed their darker-skinned ancestors wouldn't have found purchase in small mobile groups living mostly outdoors. But agriculture happened, cities rose, tuberculosis spread, rickets became endemic, and slowly, generation by generation, the survivors got lighter. This doesn't mean the other factors we've discussed weren't important. Sexual selection probably played a role. The vitamin D hypothesis for agricultural populations definitely contributed. Neanderthal genes might have provided a head start. All these factors work together, layering selection pressures on top of each other, each one pushing in the same direction. But the disease factor is the one that continued working into historical times. Long after the Ice Age ended, long after the initial migration into Europe, diseases of crowding and urbanization kept selecting for lighter skin. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Selection for light skin pigmentation in Europeans continued much more recently than anyone expected. And the most likely explanation for that ongoing selection is the disease burden of urban living in low sunlight environments. We became white, in part, because our cities were making us sick. Now we need to talk about something that happened much more recently. something that might completely upend everything we think we know about how Europeans became pale. 5,000 years ago, that's practically yesterday in evolutionary terms. Your ancestors who lived then would be biologically identical to you. Same brain size, same basic anatomy, same genetic potential. If you could raise one of their babies in the modern world, they'd grow up completely normal, indistinguishable from anyone else. But 5,000 years ago, Europe was about to experience one of the most dramatic population replacements in human history. They came from the east, from the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, the endless flat horizons stretching from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. They called themselves something we'll never know, but archaeologists call them the Yamnaya, named after the distinctive pit graves they dug for their dead, and they changed everything. The Yamnaya weren't just migrating. This wasn't a gradual drift of people looking for new territories. This was something much more dramatic, much faster, and frankly, much more violent than anything Europe had experienced since the Ice Age ended. They had horses. Not just wild horses they occasionally hunted, but domesticated horses they could ride. They had wagons with wheels, allowing them to transport entire families, possessions, and livestock across vast distances. They had bronze weapons, harder and sharper than anything the native Europeans possessed. And they had a social structure built around warrior elites, men whose status depended on their ability to raid, conquer, and accumulate wealth. When the Yamnaya arrived in Europe around 5,000 years ago, the continent was already occupied. Hunter-gatherer populations had been living there for tens of thousands of years, descendants of the same people who had survived the Ice Age. Early farmers from Anatolia had arrived several thousand years earlier, bringing agriculture and settling in permanent villages across the Mediterranean and Central Europe. These people had their own sophisticated cultures. They built massive stone monuments, created beautiful pottery, developed complex religious practices. They weren't primitive. They were simply about to meet something they'd never encountered before. Mobile, militarized pastoralists with superior technology and no qualms about taking what they wanted. The genetic evidence of what happened next is shocking. And I mean truly shocking, the kind of data that makes archaeologists uncomfortable because of what it implies. In Britain, the Yamnaya-descended populations replaced approximately 90% of the existing genetic lineage within just a few centuries. 90%. That's not migration. That's replacement. In other parts of Western Europe, the replacement ranged from 50% to 75%. Native European lineages, both the old hunter-gatherers and the early farmers, simply vanished from the gene pool. Their DNA drops to trace levels or disappears entirely, swamped by the incoming steppe ancestry. The archaeological record backs this up. Across Europe, you see dramatic changes in burial practices, pottery styles, house construction. Everything cultural shifts suddenly to steppe traditions. Entire ways of life that had existed for thousands of years disappear within a few generations. What actually happened? The genetic evidence suggests mostly male-biased replacement. Yamnaya men contributed far more DNA to modern Europeans than Yamnaya women. This pattern is consistent with conquest. Incoming males taking local wives, their sons achieving higher status and reproductive success, native male lineages being eliminated through violence or marginalization. It's an uncomfortable truth. The foundations of modern European populations may rest on a Bronze Age conquest that wiped out most of the men who were living there before. But here's where it gets relevant to our story about skin color. Did the Yamnaya bring pale skin to Europe? Or were Europeans already light-skinned by the time these steppe warriors arrived? The answer is complicated and more than a little surprising. For decades, scientists assumed that Europeans had gradually lightened over tens of thousands of years in the north. That made intuitive sense. Less sunlight, more need for vitamin D production, natural selection favoring paler skin. Simple, logical, done. Then we developed the ability to extract and sequence DNA from ancient skeletons. And the story we discovered was completely different. Cheddar Man, you might have heard of him, a hunter-gatherer skeleton found in England, dating to about 10,000 years ago, right after the Ice Age ended. When scientists reconstructed his genome, they got a shock. He had genes associated with dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. That's a combination almost never seen in modern populations, but it was apparently common in European hunter-gatherers. He wasn't alone. Genetic analysis of other ancient European hunter-gatherers shows the same pattern. Dark skin, often blue or green eyes, living in Europe for thousands of years after the Ice Age without becoming particularly pale. The early farmers from Anatolia were somewhat lighter, carrying genes for intermediate skin tones, but they weren't what we'd call white either. More like modern Middle Eastern or Mediterranean coloring. So if Europeans were still relatively dark-skinned 10,000 years ago, even 7,000 years ago, when exactly did they become pale? This is where specific genes become crucial. Two in particular, SLC24A5 and SLC4FBA2. These genes, when they carry certain mutations, dramatically reduce melanin production. They're the genetic difference between dark brown skin and pale pink skin, and we can track when these mutations swept through European populations because they leave signatures in the DNA. The answer is shocking. These pale skin variants didn't become common in Europe until sometime between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago. That's recent. Really recent. Most of Northern Europe's population may have still had relatively dark skin when agriculture was being invented in the Middle East. And here's where the Yamnaya become critically important. When geneticists analyzed ancient Yamnaya skeletons from the steppe, they found something interesting. These people carried high frequencies of the pale skin variants. The SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 mutations were already common in steppe populations before they invaded Europe. Now this creates a mystery within a mystery. Why would people living on the open steppe with no shortage of sunlight develop pale skin? The standard vitamin D explanation doesn't work as well there. Some researchers think the steppe populations got these genes from earlier interactions with Middle Eastern farmers, where they first evolved. Others think there's something about the steppe lifestyle, maybe related to diet, maybe to the particular environmental stresses of that region, that favored paler skin. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is this. When the Yamnaya rolled into Europe with their horses and wagons and bronze weapons, they brought pale skin genes with them, and because they replaced so much of the native population, those genes became dominant across the continent. This means that much of the paleness in modern Northern Europeans might not be the result of 40,000 years of gradual adaptation to cloudy skies. It might be the result of a Bronze Age population replacement that happened in just a few centuries, 5,000 years ago. The Yamnaya didn't just change European culture and language. They may have fundamentally changed what Europeans looked like. Of course, it's not quite that simple. It never is. Some pale skin genes were already present in Europe before the Yamnaya arrived, introduced by earlier farmer migrations, and natural selection certainly continued after the Yamnaya, potentially increasing the frequency of pale skin variants even further in the far north. But the Yamnaya expansion represents a moment when paleness may have gone from rare to common, when the genetic variants that define European whiteness today became widespread through demographic replacement rather than slow natural selection. This has profound implications for how we think about race and ancestry. The whiteness of Europeans isn't some ancient primordial feature that emerged in the mists of the Ice Age. It's relatively recent, possibly brought by conquerors from the East, who violently displaced the people who were living there before. Those displaced populations were themselves relatively recent arrivals, farmers from the Middle East, who had displaced even earlier hunter-gatherers. Europe's population history is layers of replacement upon replacement, invasion upon invasion, each wave bringing new genes, new cultures, new physical appearances. The pale skin that we now think of as characteristically European may have arrived with Bronze Age warriors from the steppes, riding horses that their descendants would later forget how to ride until reintroduced centuries afterward. It's a story of violence and conquest, not gentle adaptation. A story of rapid change, not slow evolution. And it happened so recently that the people involved would recognize our world, understand our language's ancestors, and comprehend our basic cultural practices. 5,000 years. That's only 200 generations. Your great-great-great-grandmother, 198 generations back, might have witnessed the Yamnaya arrival, might have seen the warriors on their horses, might have watched as everything her people had built was swept away or transformed. And she might have noticed as these strangers took over her world that their skin was paler than anything she'd seen before, that they looked different in a fundamental way, that whatever these newcomers were, they were changing not just how people lived, but what people looked like. The Yamnaya brought pale skin to Europe. Or maybe they just accelerated something that was already beginning. Either way, they transformed the continent and created the genetic foundation for what we now call European whiteness. But they weren't done changing things, because the genes they brought did more than just lighten skin. They changed how Europeans could eat, how they could digest food, how they survived in the north. And that brings us to one of the most controversial theories about European evolution. The theory that whiteness came from milk. By now, most of our story has been about ice and genes and ancient migrations, climate swings and survival strategies written in bone and DNA. But in this chapter, the ground shifts under your feet. The story moves from biology to something much stranger, something softer but just as powerful: culture. Because your skin doesn't just exist in sunlight and shadow. It exists in stories, in meanings, in the quiet judgments people make without ever saying a word. At some point in history, paleness stopped being just a side effect of living far from the equator and started becoming something else: a status symbol, a beauty ideal. Eventually, a category of identity so large and so rigid that billions of people would be sorted into it, or left out of it. That didn't happen overnight. It was a slow turning of the cultural kaleidoscope, and for most of human history, people didn't think about white the way we do now at all. So, lie back. Let the modern ideas of race and skin color loosen their grip for a moment. We're going to drift backward to when the meanings were different. Imagine the Mediterranean world a few thousand years ago. Greece, Italy, the shores of the Aegean, and the warm blue of the Levant. People there had seen every shade of human skin you can imagine. Traders from Africa, sailors from the north, merchants from deep in Asia. But they didn't divide humanity the way modern census forms do. The ancient Greeks, for instance, did notice color. They wrote poems about rosy skin, golden hair, dark eyes. But for them, what mattered more was whether you were Greek or barbarous, whether you spoke their language, followed their customs, worshipped their gods. The line between us and them ran along culture, not a color chart. Still, there were hints of something beginning to form. In classical Greek art, wealthy women are often painted with lighter skin than men. Not ghostly pale, just lighter, softer, untouched by the sun. Men, constantly outdoors in fields, ships, and battlefields, are painted darker, tanned by labor and war. Color here is quietly saying something about lifestyle, about class, about who has to work outside and who doesn't. The Romans took this even further. In Rome, elite women sometimes dusted their faces with white lead to appear paler, risking slow poisoning for the sake of fashion. Pale skin meant you were indoors, protected, shielded from hard labor. Slaves and commoners did the farming, the quarrying, the rowing. The sun marked their bodies. The lack of sun marked yours. But notice what's missing. They didn't yet think of themselves as white people in the modern sense. Romans distinguished people by citizenship, by freedom versus slavery, by whether you were Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Gaul, or Jew. Skin color was part of the visual landscape, but not yet the master code. In the Roman imagination, Ethiopians with very dark skin and northern tribes with very light skin were both exotic extremes, both part of the human tapestry. Ancient writers sometimes even admired dark skin as a sign of toughness, or northern paleness as a sign of ruggedness. Beauty ideals shifted with context, gender, and class. The idea that all the light people of the world formed one race, opposed to all the dark people, simply did not exist. Now let the centuries slow down and blur. Rome falls, cities shrink, trade routes twist and fray. We slip into medieval Europe, where something subtle but important starts to happen to the meaning of pale. Picture a small stone castle on a gray morning. Inside, candlelight flickers on embroidered walls. The nobility live mostly indoors. Their days are spent in halls and chapels, not plowing fields or hauling nets. Outside, peasants bend over soil, work in the open air, bake under summer suns and winter winds. Skin tone becomes a visible record of how you live. Medieval Europeans begin to associate paleness with nobility, not with a race, but with rank. The more sheltered your life, the less the sun touches you. The less the sun touches you, the more your skin signals that you are someone who is protected, privileged, removed from manual labor. Illuminated manuscripts and courtly romances praise fair ladies, their skin white as milk, or like ivory. It is an ideal of delicacy and fragility, not biology. Peasants, who cannot afford to stay indoors, grow browned by weather. Tanned skin means you work, and work hard. The social hierarchy writes itself directly onto the body in layers of melanin. And yet, even here, people are not white in the modern sense. Medieval Christians thought primarily in terms of Christian versus non-Christian, noble versus commoner, free versus serf. They met dark-skinned North Africans, Jews, steppe nomads, and many others. Religious difference mattered more than skin tone. Salvation and damnation were the big categories, not race. If someone from that time stepped into the modern world and heard us talk about white as a giant category uniting Swedes, Italians, Irish, and Russians, they might be confused. You mean all the palish Christians from different kingdoms? For them, those differences were enormous. The English and the French went to war, not as members of a shared race, but as rival peoples under rival kings. And yet the association between pale skin and higher status was slowly hardening. Cosmetics recipes for women's whitening creams spread. Noble women in Europe, like their Roman predecessors, sometimes used dangerous ingredients like lead and mercury to appear more pale. 1,000 years of indoor aristocratic life carved a connection in the cultural mind. Paler means higher. The real flip, though, the moment when white starts to become more than beauty or class, when it begins to crystallize into a racial identity, comes later. Much later. Around the time sails from Europe began cutting across entire oceans, now we move into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. European ships reached the Americas, West Africa, South Asia, the Pacific. Suddenly, European explorers, merchants, and conquerors are encountering huge populations of people whose skins span the full spectrum from very dark to very light, whose cultures and technologies rival or surpass their own in many ways. At first, they still think in religious and cultural terms, Christian versus heathen, civilized versus savage in their language. But colonialism needs more than labels. It needs justification. It needs a story that says it is right, or at least acceptable, for some humans to rule over others, to take their land, to force their labor. Skin color becomes a convenient symbol. In the colonies, social hierarchy begins to map onto visible differences in a way that's quicker and cruder than medieval class. Europeans, mostly lighter-skinned on average because of their northern ancestry, put themselves at the top. Indigenous peoples and Africans, often darker-skinned, are pushed to the bottom. Laws, not just prejudices, start to reflect this. In the English colonies of North America, for example, there is a slow, deliberate shift. Early on, there are African slaves, European indentured servants, and free people from many backgrounds all jostling uneasily together. Over time, colonial elites construct a legal system that hardens the boundaries. They begin to use the word white to describe not just a skin tone, but a protected legal category. White people can own land. White people can own slaves. White people have rights that Negroes, Indians, and later even some mixed ancestry groups do not. What began as class and religion evolves into race law. This is where the cultural flip becomes unmistakable. Being pale stops being just beautiful or aristocratic. It becomes a passport, a shield, a justification. The same biological feature that evolved for vitamin D and low sunlight now helps decide who can vote, testify in court, marry whom, or be enslaved. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European thinkers begin to systematize this into something that looks scientific, at least to them. Naturalists and philosophers start drawing up charts. They propose categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, and others. These are the earliest modern race theories. Before this, differences were noticed, sometimes exaggerated, but not arranged into a global rigid hierarchy. Now, scholars in wigs and powdered faces calmly write that white Europeans are at the top of a natural order. They claim this order is based on reason and observation, not on conquest and fear. They classify humans the way they classify plants and animals, putting their own group in the most favorable position. Race, in the modern sense, is born here, not out of science, but out of empire. Colonialism gives skin color new power. On plantations in the Caribbean, in silver mines in South America, on cotton fields in North America, paleness and darkness become shorthand for who commands and who obeys. Mixed ancestry populations present a problem to a system that wants clear lines, so more categories are created. Mulatto, mestizo, quadroon, octoroon, each label tied to specific rights or restrictions. The hierarchy is inscribed not just in law, but in language, in art, in theology. Children grow up learning that white almost automatically means pure, clean, innocent. Black becomes associated with sin, dirt, danger. Those metaphorical associations are ancient in European languages, but in the age of empire they fuse with literal skin color in a way that's unprecedented. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, the idea of being white slowly begins to unite people who had previously thought of themselves primarily as English, French, Spanish, Italian, German. As they encounter the non-European world, Africa, Asia, the Americas, they gradually see themselves as part of a larger category: European, Christian, and eventually white. This identity is not just physical, it's political. It justifies colonies, slave ships, unequal treaties. The lighter your skin, The closer you are to the center of power, it's important to remember how recent this all is. The invention of race categories as we know them, white, black, Asian, belongs mostly to the last 300 or 400 years. For over 90% of our species' history, humans had no such boxes. You were part of a band, a village, a people, a language group. Your skin was one of countless variations, noticed but rarely elevated into a destiny. The cultural flip that is not just when pale became beautiful. It's when pale became meaningful in a way that could move armies and write laws. When the quiet class codes of Roman makeup and medieval courtly love expanded into a global project of sorting humanity by color. And yet, under all of that, the biology never changed its story. Skin was still doing what it had always done, balancing UV protection with vitamin D production, adapting slowly to latitude and diet and climate. The genes that shaped the tone of your skin had no idea they would one day be used to build empires. As you drift towards sleep, you can hold both truths at once. There is the ancient, simple story written in cells and sunlight, and layered over it, the much newer, much messier story written in laws, poems, paintings, and prejudices. The mystery of how humans became white is not just about who migrated where or which mutations spread through which valleys. It's about how, at a certain moment in history, a particular shade of skin was given a crown, a flag, and a name: white. An identity that never existed for most of our past, but now shapes how billions of people move through the world. In the next part of our journey, we'll see another twist, because even in the heart of Europe, at the supposed center of whiteness, the picture is far more varied and olive-toned than the story usually admits. Picture the average ancient European that lives in your imagination. Maybe it's a Roman senator in a white toga, a Greek philosopher, a medieval knight, a Renaissance painter. In most modern minds, they all tend to share the same thing. They look basically white, not just light. Modern white, Northern European white, the kind of skin tone that almost glows under fluorescent lights. But that picture is wrong, or at least incomplete, because the people who actually lived in those places, under those suns, eating those foods, walking those landscapes, they were not as white as you think. Let's start at the shoreline. Imagine the Mediterranean at noon, 2,000 years ago. The sun is brutal. The sky's a sheet of polished blue glass. You're standing in a fishing village on the coast of what we now call Italy, or Greece, or Tunisia, or southern Spain. Your neighbors don't have the wax-pale skin of a northern winter. They have skin that knows the sun. Olive, tan, copper, deep brown. Skin that darkens easily, that holds pigment, that doesn't burn at the first hint of ultraviolet light. This wasn't an exception. It was normal. Basic biology tells us why. Settle a farming and seafaring population in an environment with strong sunlight, reflective seas, and outdoor labor, and something predictable happens. People who can tolerate that sunlight without constant damage do better. They farm more, fish more, survive more. Their children inherit those traits. Now add another layer: history. For tens of thousands of years, the European story was not a straight, isolated line. It was a crossroads. North Africa, the Near East, the Levant, Anatolia, the Caucasus. Populations mixing, trading, migrating. Genes for darker skin and genes for lighter skin crossed paths again and again. They didn't read borders. They didn't care about future racial categories. The idea of a solid, uniform, white Europe is a very recent invention. Ancient Europe, especially around the Mediterranean, was a patchwork of complexions. And a lot of those complexions would read today as brown or olive, not pale. We don't have color photographs of Julius Caesar or Cleopatra, but we do have something almost as good: DNA. In the last decade, geneticists have pulled ancient DNA from skeletons buried across Europe. Hunters buried 10,000 years ago in Spain. Farmers buried 7,000 years ago in Greece. Citizens of Roman London. Medieval villagers in Italy and Germany. When they look at the genes that influence skin color, a pattern emerges. Some ancient Europeans carried variants linked to relatively light skin, but many did not. And even when lighter variants show up, they don't always match modern levels. In several regions, the full, pale European genetic package doesn't become common until surprisingly recently, sometimes within the last few thousand years, or even the last 1,000 or 2,000. In other words, there's good evidence that a lot of Europeans in the deep past were darker than their descendants. And even more intriguing, Europeans in some regions might be paler now than their own medieval or classical ancestors. Now, move your imagination north. You're in Iron Age Scandinavia, or Bronze Age Britain, or some damp forested valley in what will one day be Germany. The sun is weaker here. Winters are long. Summers are brief and soft. You might assume everyone is already ghost pale, frost elf white. But the story isn't that simple. Ancient DNA from Northern Europe reveals something surprising. Some early hunter-gatherers in places like Sweden carried combinations of genes that today we associate with darker skin and lighter eyes, or medium skin and blue eyes, or other unexpected mixes. Not the uniform, pinkish beige we tend to imagine. It took time, thousands of years of farming, of new populations moving in from the steppe, of changing diets and environments, for the especially pale skin tones we now think of as typically Northern European to become common. So historically, there were dramatic differences between the North and the South. But even in the North, past Europeans were not necessarily as light as modern stereotypes suggest. And in the South, many would have been visibly darker than the modern Mediterranean stereotype, which has already been bleached a bit by imagination and media. Think about what life actually looked like. No sunscreen, no sunglasses, no office cubicles, no cars with tinted windows. Most people worked outside, plowing fields, herding animals, fishing, walking, fighting, harvesting, building. A farmer in medieval Italy didn't spend 90% of his daylight hours behind glass. A sailor in classical Greece wasn't under LED lighting. Their skin was constantly talking to the sun, and the sun was answering back layer by layer, year after year. Modern people underestimate how much environment alone can change appearance. Take someone with an olive genetic base tone. They move to a cloudy place, work indoors, wear long sleeves, use sunscreen, avoid tanning. After a few years, they might appear several shades lighter than their grandparents did at the same age. No genes changed, just light, just lifestyle. Now reverse it. Put that same person under a Mediterranean sun with no modern protections, farming or fishing all day, starting in childhood, year-round. The skin they live in by age 30 will be a very different color than the one they would have had under office lights. So when you picture ancient Mediterranean people through the filter of modern indoor life, you're already making them too pale. But there's another layer distorting things. Art. We tend to believe what we see. Marble statues in museums, smooth and white. Faded frescoes with gently tinted faces. Medieval paintings where everyone from peasants to saints looked suspiciously light. It's easy to look at a row of marble Roman busts and think, they were all pale like this. But those statues were never meant to be white. They were painted brightly. Eyes, lips, hair, clothing, and yes, skin tone, the original colors have mostly eroded away, leaving bare stone that tricks us into imagining a colorless antiquity. Paintings pose another problem. Artists didn't work like cameras, they worked like storytellers. They exaggerated what mattered to the people paying them. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, lightness often got loaded with symbolism. Light as purity, light as holiness, light as spiritual cleanliness. So religious figures, Christ, Mary, saints, angels, were often painted with lighter skin, no matter what the actual population looked like. Elite patrons sometimes wanted to be portrayed closer to those ideals, so their faces could quietly drift paler on the canvas than their real-world reflections. Written records distort things too. When ancient writers mention dark skin, they often do it because it stands out to them. Foreigners, travelers, outsiders. This can give the impression that their own populations were lighter than they truly were. If you only remark on contrast, you miss the base tone, you forget the middle, and remember, almost all this art and writing comes from people at the top. Urban elites, clergy, nobility. Yet most people in Europe were peasants, sailors, soldiers, laborers, poor, outdoor, sun-exposed. The faces that fill modern textbooks are not a balanced sample of historical skin tones. They're a small, biased slice, filtered through symbolism, class, and later interpretation. Genetics cuts through some of that fog. When you sequence ancient genomes from Mediterranean burial sites, you find alleles, gene variants, associated with higher melanin production, darker hair, darker eyes, and complexions that tan easily. Not in every skeleton, not everywhere, but often enough to challenge the idea of a uniformly pale southern Europe. And yet, when you walk through a modern European city today, especially in the north, something stands out. You see a lot of very light skin, lighter, on average, than you would have seen in many places in the past. Why? Part of it is centuries of shifting ancestry. Migrations, plagues, wars, social structures that favored certain groups over others. Part of it is natural selection in low-light environments. Genes that lighten skin to help synthesize vitamin D might have been favored over time, especially in higher latitudes, especially with low vitamin D diets. But part of it isn't genetic at all. It's just modern life, indoor work, glass windows that block UV, clothing that covers more of the body for more of the year, sunscreen in the summer, shade in cities, even fear of aging skin. We've turned down the volume on the sun side of the conversation, and skin has quietly shifted lighter across many populations, without a single mutation needing to change. So when people today look back and project their own winter office complexions onto ancient farmers, sailors, and shepherds, they're seeing a ghost version of the past, a version drained of sun, drained of work, confined to climate control. There's one more wrinkle. Modern categories like white, black, brown, olive are social inventions laid on top of a continuous biological gradient. Ancient people didn't line up neatly within these modern color boxes. They flowed across them. A Roman crowd would not have looked like a homogeneous wall of identically pale faces. It would have been a spectrum, light and dark, freckled and clear, easily tanned and rarely tanned, faces weathered by sea spray and mountain snow, faces shaded by city alleys and faces carved by open fields. When we say Europeans got white, we're already simplifying something much messier. Many never did become the kind of white our stereotypes imagine. Many only did so recently. And many, especially around the Mediterranean, were probably closer in complexion to people we now call Middle Eastern or North African than to the caricature of a porcelain-skinned northerner. So the olive complexion reality is this. Ancient and medieval Europeans were not a frozen block of pallor. Mediterranean peoples, in particular, were often considerably darker than our marble statues and washed-out paintings suggest. The North and the South were different, but neither matched the clean, modern categories in our heads. Modern Europeans, especially in the age of offices and sunscreen, may actually be paler, in practice, than many of their own ancestors. The past was shaded, sun-touched, variable. And the story of how white Europe became a story in the first place, how a fluid range of tones got compressed into one brittle idea, that has less to do with biology and more to do with power, culture, and myth. To understand that, we have to follow the migrations, because there was a moment when new people arrived, bringing new genes, new faces, and new ideas about who belonged where. That's where we turn next. Now, zoom all the way forward. Neanderthals are gone. Denisovans are ghosts in our DNA. The Ice Age has come and gone. Agriculture, cities, empires, all of it has risen and fallen. You're lying in bed in a world lit by LED screens, scrolling past faces from every continent. Planes cross oceans in hours. People move between continents the way your Ice Age ancestors moved between valleys. If pale skin in Europe was sculpted by hundreds of generations of brutal selection, what happens when the environment changes again? What happens when ships, caravans, and airplanes start bringing dark-skinned people into Europe in large numbers? Does the continent re-darken? Do the evolutionary clocks run backwards? On the surface, it seems like they should. For the last 500 years, European populations haven't been sealed off anymore. Traders, enslaved people, soldiers, students, refugees, and workers have been moving in and out. North and West Africans into Spain, Italy, and France. South Asians into Britain. Middle Eastern populations into Germany and Scandinavia. Caribbean and African diasporas into almost every major European and North American city. If you picture evolution as a kind of color-mixing paint tray, you might expect Europe to have visibly darkened by now. A little more melanin in every generation. A slow fade from pale to tan. But when geneticists actually look, something strange appears. The reverse migration darkening hasn't really happened. At least, not in the simple, obvious way you might imagine. Part of the reason is time. The selection for pale skin in high latitudes played out over tens of thousands of years. That's thousands of generations of small advantages piling up. A 1 or 2% reproductive edge, repeated over and over and over again, until the genes for lighter skin became common enough to reshape a continent. In contrast, large-scale global mixing has been going on for maybe 20 generations, often less. In some regions, just 5 or 6. In evolutionary terms, that's a blink, not a movie, just a single frame. But that's only half the story, because if you zoom into individual families, into the lives of people whose ancestries cross continents, you do see something important. Skin color is changing, just not in a simple linear direction. Imagine a child with one Northern European parent and one West African parent. Statistically, their skin tone will be somewhere in between, but in between isn't fixed. The same two parents can have one child who looks quite dark, another who looks medium brown, another who looks relatively light. That's because skin color isn't controlled by a single gene with a simple on-off switch. It's controlled by many genes, each nudging melanin production up or down. Now imagine that child grows up in London, or Paris, or Berlin, and has children with someone whose ancestry is mostly European. On average, their children will tend to be lighter than them, but still darker than the European grandparent. Run that process for a few generations, African plus European, then back crossing into majority European, and you don't get a continent rapidly turning dark. You get a subtle gradient of tones, with some individuals still quite pale, some medium, some darker. all occupying the same spaces. This pattern shows up in the data. Studies of mixed populations in the Americas, people with European, African, and indigenous American ancestry, find that skin color can shift noticeably within just 2 or 3 generations of intermarriage. Children can be several shades lighter or darker than their grandparents, depending on which gene variants they inherit. But at the population level, the average doesn't swing wildly. It drifts slowly. A community that starts at, say, 80% European ancestry and 20% African ancestry doesn't jump to mostly dark overnight. Even after centuries, the genetics of pigmentation remain mixed and variable. Some individuals carry combinations of pale skin genes that make them look almost entirely European. Others carry combinations that make them look much darker, even if on paper their ancestry proportions are similar. So individual families can change quickly, whole populations not so much. Then there's the deeper question: can evolution run in reverse? If pale skin was an adaptation to low UV and limited vitamin D in Europe, could natural selection now favor darker skin again? The environment has changed. Vitamin D pills exist. Diets are richer. People spend much of their time indoors, behind glass and under artificial light. Sunscreen, clothing, and buildings buffer UV more than clouds ever could. For many Europeans today, the old selection pressures that once favored paler skin have mostly vanished. At the same time, skin cancer risk is now better understood, and UV exposure is less predictable. Travel from a cloudy northern city to a tropical beach takes few hours. That kind of sudden environmental jump never existed for your Ice Age ancestors. You might imagine selection slowly nudging European skin tones darker again, balancing vitamin D and UV damage under these new conditions. But evolutionary change isn't just about pressures, it's about birth and death. For natural selection to significantly reshape skin color, people with one set of pigment genes would have to consistently have more surviving children than people with another set. Not just slightly more in one generation, but more generation after generation after generation. In the modern world, fertility is shaped more by economics, education, contraception, and culture than by the exact shade of your skin. People don't typically fail to reproduce because of rickets or sunburn anymore. They delay children because of university, housing costs, and career paths. Those aren't traits your genes can adapt to in a simple way. That doesn't mean selection has stopped entirely. It never truly stops. But its power to radically reshape a trait like skin color across a whole continent is now much weaker than it was when survival hinged on whether your body could pull vitamin D out of a thin winter sun. And then there's the invisible force that slows reverse darkening even more. Assortative mating. In theory, if everyone mixed randomly with everyone else, genetic variants would spread and blend smoothly. In practice, humans don't mate randomly. People tend to choose partners somewhat similar to themselves, culturally, linguistically, religiously, and yes, often physically, not always consciously. Sometimes through patterns baked into neighborhoods, schools, and social circles. In many European countries, the children of immigrants often grow up to marry people from similar backgrounds, especially in the first and second generation. That creates subpopulations within the larger society. Clusters where darker skin remains common, clusters where lighter skin remains common, and mixed zones in between. From a genetic point of view, this slows down the mixing. It doesn't stop it. But it keeps the overall distribution of traits, including pigmentation, more varied and patchy than a simple, everyone blends with everyone model would predict. Social forces reinforce this. Beauty standards, discrimination, ideas about identity and belonging. All of these can influence who marries whom and where they choose to raise children. Over centuries, those choices leave fingerprints in the gene pool. So when you step back and ask, is Europe darkening? The answer is nuanced. Locally, yes. Urban centers especially are far more diverse than they were 500 years ago. You can see full spectrums of skin tone walking down the streets of London, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Madrid. Genetically, the old, pure continental boundaries are blurring. DNA studies show traces of African, Middle Eastern, and Asian ancestry scattered across Europe in places where the eye might not notice. But at the broad continental scale, the shift is subtle, not a dramatic reversal. More like a slow softening of edges, the ancient adaptation to low light, the cluster of pale skin genes that spread in Ice Age Europe, hasn't been erased. It's simply now sharing the stage with other variants from other parts of the world. And globally, something even more interesting is happening. Europe isn't the only place receiving migrants. Millions of people of European ancestry live in high UV environments. Australia, South Africa, Latin America, the American South, the Caribbean. There, the old pale in the north, dark in the tropics pattern is being rewritten. Dark-skinned and light-skinned people live side by side under the same sun, protected not by melanin alone, but by roofs, clothing, and sunscreen. When anthropologists simulate future scenarios using realistic rates of migration and intermarriage, they don't see a world becoming uniformly pale or uniformly dark. They see a slow move toward intermediate tones with huge local variation, a gradient, not a uniform color. Think of it as the planet returning to something more like its deep past. Before the bottlenecks and the ice ages and the long isolations, early humans in Africa already carried a wide range of pigmentation. Some darker, some lighter, depending on region, lifestyle, and microclimate. Diversity was the rule, not the exception. Our recent history of sharply divided races is, in that sense, an anomaly, a side effect of geography, climate, and temporary isolation, suddenly disrupted by ships and jets. If the current trends continue, mass migration, gradual relaxing of social barriers, more intermarriage across old lines, the long-term future of human skin color is probably not a return to some ancestral dark or a permanent pale north and dark south. It's a mosaic. Cities where every possible shade stands in the same subway car. Rural regions where older patterns persist longer. Families where one generation looks like they could come from one continent and the next looks like they could come from another, even though they share the same grandparents. Evolution won't stop. But the game board has changed. Natural selection is no longer the sole sculptor. Culture, technology, and global movement now push and pull on our gene pool in ways no Ice Age hunter could have imagined. The reverse migration darkening that some expected, the idea that pale Europe would quickly be recolored by a wave of darker genes, turns out to misunderstand how both evolution and society work. Pale skin in Europe was never a simple on-off switch that could be flicked back by a few generations of mixing. It was a slow, cumulative response to specific conditions. Those conditions are gone. The new conditions are different, more complex, and in many ways less brutal. Instead of a continent changing shade, what we are seeing is something quieter. Edges blurring, boundaries softening, genes that once evolved in isolation now meeting again in the same cities, in the same families, under the same roofs. The real story isn't about darkening or whitening. It's about returning to variation, to gradients, to a human species whose skin tells a story not of separation, but of connection. And that, in the end, may be the most important twist in this whole tale. We spent hundreds of thousands of years scattered and divided by ice, mountains, deserts, and distance. We evolved different shades for different suns, different bodies for different climates. Now we're bringing it all back together. The question is no longer, why did Europeans become white? It's slowly becoming, what happens when all the separate experiments in being human start blending again? And as you drift towards sleep, you are carrying the answer in your own cells, a history of bottlenecks and expansions, of isolations and reunions, written in pigments just under your skin. The story of how humans became white, and why, even now, that story's still being rewritten. So now you know the rough outline of the story, not just how humans became white or brown or golden or olive, but how a handful of survivors squeezed through an evolutionary bottleneck ended up painting the world in different shades of the same skin. But here's the thing. The story you just heard is not the only version. It's a map, not the territory. Different people, different cultures, different ideologies, all look at the same fossils, the same genes, the same climate records, and see different meanings. Some cling to the idea that whiteness is a kind of upgrade, an evolutionary prize. Others insist it's just a side effect, a footnote in a much bigger saga of adaptation, migration, and chance. Some want the story to prove that race is real and eternal. Others want it to prove that race is an illusion. The science doesn't fully cooperate with any of them. When scientists look at skin color, they don't see destiny. They see a patchwork of genes, each with its own history. Some variants came from Neanderthals, some from ancient African populations. Some rose to prominence only in the last few thousand years. Some may have spread because of vitamin D, others because of disease, others because of beauty standards that shifted with the climate and the crops people learned to grow. And the truth is, the research is still unfolding. New ancient DNA samples are being sequenced. New fossils are being dug out of caves and riverbanks. Old theories about milk or sexual selection or disease get challenged, revised, or sometimes quietly abandoned. What seems certain in one decade suddenly looks incomplete in the next. So any story we tell tonight is by definition unfinished. What we can say with confidence is that skin color changed fast, at least in evolutionary terms. In just a few thousand years, populations in Northern Europe shifted from mostly dark-skinned to mostly light-skinned. In other regions, the change went the other way, or barely happened at all. Under the right pressures, a few genetic tweaks can redraw the visible map of humanity in what amounts to an evolutionary blink. And if it changed that fast before, it can change again. New diets, new diseases, new climates, new patterns of intermarriage and migration. All of these will keep quietly sculpting human skin long after we're gone. The palette is still being mixed. The painting is not finished. So why does this story matter? On one level, maybe it doesn't. The person you are, the choices you make, the kindness you show, none of that is determined by the exact balance of melanin in your skin. From the perspective of your ancient ancestors, huddled around a fire during an Ice Age night, what mattered was simple. Are you willing to share food? Will you stand watch? Will you help carry a child when the group has to move? And yet, the story does matter, because stories are how we decide who we are. If we tell ourselves that whiteness, or any skin color, is a mark of superiority, we end up building walls. If we tell ourselves that skin color is just one tiny adaptation among thousands, born of sunlight and seasons and chance encounters with ancient humans, the walls start to look unnecessary, even a little absurd. You can choose which story to keep. You can hold in your mind as you fall asleep the image of those scattered bands of ancestors, dark-skinned people under blazing equatorial suns, lighter-skinned people under gray northern skies, all of them carrying the same fused chromosome, all of them descendants of the same fragile bottleneck, all of them, in some deep genetic sense, family. As you drift, you might let your thoughts wander. How will future humans tell this story 100,000 years from now, if anyone is still around to tell it? Will they laugh at our obsessions with color, the way we laugh at ancient rivalries we barely understand? Or will they be gentler, remembering that confusion is part of what it means to be human? Before you close your eyes completely, if you'd like to help this little community grow, you can gently tap like, or subscribe, or leave a comment. If you feel awake enough, tell us where you're listening from. The city, the country, or maybe just under a warm blanket in a small, quiet room. If you want to support the channel more directly, you can even join our YouTube membership. It helps us make more long, careful stories like this one. But it's completely optional. Your presence here, listening, is already enough. For now, you don't have to solve any of the mysteries. You don't have to pick a theory, or settle the debates, or decide exactly why some of your ancestors' skin grew lighter while others stayed dark. You can just let the questions hover softly in the dark. Let the ice ages and migrations fade into the background. Let the noise of history turn into a gentle hum. Feel your breath slow. Feel your body grow heavy. Remember that under all the colors, all the stories, all the arguments, there is a simple, quiet fact. You are the descendant of survivors, and tonight it's enough just to rest.